Welcome to this edition of Security and Compliance Weekly. Today we're joined by Rafal, the White Rabbit himself, host of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. I stumbled upon a blog that's Raf posted last week entitled Vulnerability Management is Still a Mess, and I found that many of his musings were pretty much in line with what I've been thinking about as I've been informally studying vulnerability management for the last month or so. So I thought, good reason to have him on the show. So he graciously accepted the invitation. Here we go. The topic today is going to be vulnerability management. And ironically, we're dovetailing again, like we did last week, off of a discussion that we started on Paul's Security Weekly. So if you want to catch up, if you haven't already, you can check out episode 688 entitled Taming Vulnerability Overload. Raf is also on the Discord server, so he is in for the whole experience today. So join us as we continue our journey of tearing down silos and building bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly.
Welcome to episode 67 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on March 30th, 2021. I can't believe we're like a third of the way through the year already. I am your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, and today I'm joined by my illustrious co-hosts, Mr. Scott Lyons, Mr. Josh Marpet, and Mr. Frederick Flea Lee. Greetings, gentlemen. It's also a particularly exciting day for me because as we are broadcasting in about 20 minutes, my wife is leaving to go off and get her first vaccination. Very exciting at this house. We have a grandchild that we haven't met yet because of the stupid coronavirus. And a lot of people have died as well.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes, sir.
Today is also 3 days past the 5th year anniversary of Red Lion.
Oh, happy anniversary, Red Lion.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, as my grandkids like to say. Hey, if you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly, you can do so by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or on our YouTube channel, or you can sign up for our mailing list or our Discord server. And, drumroll please, we're also on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch, which I haven't partaken of yet, so I don't have the itch to get on Twitch, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a dad.
Penicillin will help that itch.
Anyway, thank you. Also, if you have a specific guest or topic request that you want us to cover on any one of our shows, submit your suggestions by going to securityweekly.com/guest. You'll find a form there. Fill it out. We review those suggestions on a regular basis, and we will get back to you about scheduling if we decide to move forward with your idea. All right, let's get to it. I first met Raf, I guess virtually about 6 years ago when he invited me to be interviewed on his own podcast, which is called Down the Security Rabbit Hole. It happened to be episode 124, and my recollection was, and I forget how he came across me, but I was working at Tenable at the time, and he saw something that said I was a PCI evangelist, and he's like, "What? PCI security? Hackers? What?" And so he just had to get me on the show. Also, if I'm not mistaken, Santar Cangelo was doing the podcast back then. Is that right, Raph?
Yeah, he was. Back when.
And he was also affiliated with us. Still is, I guess, officially. Although I haven't talked to him in a blue moon. But anyway, got on the show and we bump into each other every couple of years or every conference or so back when that was a thing. So welcome, Raf, to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be on the show. A year into our 2 month, 2 week, 2 day, whatever it is, lockdown. So good to be here.
Think of it as a 15-year lockdown. Just we're going to get out early for good behavior.
So much irony.
No, it doesn't work like that.
So speaking of down the security rabbit hole, you mentioned when we were talking the other day, you're going on 10 years of doing that podcast.
September will be 10 years. We're at almost 440 episodes. I've had some really interesting guests on the show. I've had
me.
I think some of well, yeah, of course you, but I've actually had interesting people too.
I'm sorry. Do you need some salve that burn?
Ooh.
Cheap shot. Anyway, so now
who invited him on here? No, I'm just messing.
We've had David Cameron's the Right Honorable Baroness Neville Jones at one point. Dan Gear. We've had Jason Whitty, who's now just the guy that reports to Jamie Dimon over at the bank as a CISO. Just recently recorded one, actually released as we record this. Actually today or yesterday. Lonnie Price, who headed up cybersecurity for diplomatic security services, part of Department of State. For he's been there for 30 years. That is a good story. So many cool guests, man. It's been awesome.
Great. Well, we usually like to start our shows by getting to know our guests a little bit. Obviously you're a podcaster, but tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into security, and feel free to mention in passing what you're doing these days.
I'm somewhere around 23-ish years. I feel like that explains like I'm doing time, but I've been about 23 years in the industry, guys. Living the crazy life, I guess. AppSec background, enterprise background, worked for a couple small companies you may have heard of once or twice. GE, HP, did some time there. Learned a lot. I think the story I tell everybody that tries to get an idea of sort of what my background's like is I was a wide-eyed, bushy-tailed pen tester. I got to know Rob Graham because back when he built the packet driver, the high-speed packet driver for Network ICE, a couple of the folks that I was working with in Atlanta at the time, in my first actual legit on-job title security job, we broke it for him. We
there you go. Did this just for you. Broke it.
And I'm not to distract. I'm just noticing that that's not a handkerchief in your pocket. That's actually a little bunny.
That is a rabbit in my pocket, and I am happy to see you.
That's
I just never mind. Okay.
That's Frank. My daughter named Frank. So he's custom made. If you guys want one, I can procure you one.
You could be in the Christmas Story bunny suit, I guess. So
it could be way worse. This is the professional version of dressing up with the little. I don't do the pieces of flair anymore. I stopped working at TGI Fridays as a teenager, but I now have my piece of flair. Lovely young lady that I have the pleasure of knowing makes these things, and if you guys are interested, I can hook you up. But you have to have your own spirit animal,
with
right?
The young lady
spirit animal and a color.
Never mind. Let's move on.
Wait, I didn't get to tell you what I do for a living.
Oh, well, go ahead.
So right now, just by way of relevance to this conversation, work for a company called Lightstream out of Salt Lake City. Funny bar story of how I got here, but when one disaster implodes, another great opportunity opens, and it's been great. Chief security strategist or VP of security strategy, whichever job title you like better. Building, as I like to put it, an MSSP that doesn't suck inside of a successful 18-year-old cloud and networking company, because much like many of us working for security companies, we realize there's more. The problem to fix is not actually in this peddling security kit. So that's where I'm doing now, and the relevance here is that kicked off a vulnerability management as a service program in a box, as you could call it, but it's a full scale practice. So that's how I got to this conversation, and that's where you found me.
So we'll spend the course of the show trying to shoot holes in your offering, I guess. Cool.
I'm sure there's plenty.
We also like to ask all of our guests what we call the hot seat question, and because this is a show that's about security and compliance and trying to connect the dots between the two things, as I'm sure you're aware, compliance somewhat has a bad name in the hacker security crowd, and security hackers are not necessarily well known in the compliance world, at least in my experience. So we simply like to ask, no right or wrong answer. We're just trying to level set where you're coming from. Where do you fall on what we like to call the security versus compliance continuum?
Where do I fall? I fall probably much like I do with everything, somewhere in the logical, sane middle. I think compliance drives change because that's essentially where where rubber meets paycheck and people who actually sign checks to make things happen. Right? Accountability is done at the compliance level, at the regulatory level. So if you're talking about compliance, I'm assuming we're talking capital C, regulatory compliance, and if that's the case, then we all poke holes in it, and we talk about the fact that it's always lagging and never quite right. But ultimately, things like SOX, PCI, SOC 2, whatever, pick your regulatory compliance thing. That's what drives change. It's been driving change since I've been in the industry. And as much as we complain about it, without those things, I don't know if any of us would actually have jobs.
Well, definitely not the job security that we enjoy in today's climate. Let's be clear, okay? But I love the point you're making. Sorry, do me a favor, back up a step. So you said capital C compliance, regulatory compliance.
Yes.
What's the other, the non-capital C compliance?
Security compliance, right? So compliance to security policy, things that we say, best practice, call it. I hate best practice, so I just call it security compliance.
That's right.
Because the term best practice has been beaten to death by people who don't understand anything about security and live in marketing all day. And it just means whatever I decide.
Like every other term in our industry has been beaten
right.
to death.
It's been,
as we're about to discuss in terms of this term vulnerability management.
Yeah, but security compliance, right? Security people have goals. We want to set a legitimate level, a baseline, a policy level that we're comfortable with, which is not always on the same level as the compliance folks would like. So a regulatory compliance. So we find sort of like where the two don't meet, and then we try to make them intersect.
Got you. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask, where does PCI fall in your perspective of big C, little c, or C in the middle, as the case may be?
It's a 4-letter word, but it's definitely... I love you, man. But PCI tends to be one of the ones... So this is my problem with PCI, is that it's one of the most referenced pieces of regulatory compliance and things that actually could have a major impact on business, but sometimes simply choose not to because of the way it's enforced. But it has some it moves so slowly, and it's because, for various reasons, I don't know the inner workings of it, but from an outsider, it's like 10,000 people deciding what to order on a pizza. Nothing happens until we reach consensus. Meanwhile, 98% of them die of starvation. So that's kind of where PCI is.
That's an interesting perspective, and not completely without merit or unwarranted.
Again, outsider.
But a fairly more astute observation about PCI than what I generally encounter, at least in the security hackers side of the world, who, strangely enough, very often think that PCI has little more to do with anything rather than a vulnerability scan, which sort of can help us to segue into a conversation of vulnerability management.
Yeah, that brings us right there.
I will let you riff on your blog, because I thought you made some very interesting points. I will just set it up from my perspective, where I've been doing research on vulnerability management sort of informally, and by research I mean I've been asking questions on the Twitterverse and letting people respond and just seeing where people are coming from. But my issue with vulnerability management stems from the fact that in the PCI data security standard, which has 6 major goals that are spread out into 12 major requirements, there is a section that's actually entitled Maintain a Vulnerability Management Program. In that category, which is one of the 6 goals of PCI, you have requirement 5 and requirement 6, just 2 requirements. Within those 2 requirements, you've got the antivirus, anti-malware requirement. That's requirement 5. And requirement 6 is sort of a weird, to me, it's always been a weird hodgepodge of identify vulnerabilities, have a risk ranking criteria so you can rank the vulnerabilities, patch your systems when critical security patches come out, have change management program, change control procedures, do secure application development, make sure all your developers are trained so you're producing secure code, and keep them trained and keep them up to speed on what's going on from an application development perspective. So the perspective of vulnerability management in a PCI context has a lot to do with, you've got something out there that you've either created or you've deployed, keep it secure. And that's the essence of vulnerability management. Vulnerability scanning, which seems to be a large part of vulnerability management if you just look out on the web and Google the terms, and I think you reference it in your blog, comes many requirements later, not till requirement 11. So I've always thought in my mind that requirement 11, which is where you've got pen testing and when you've got vulnerability scanning and other security related activities like file integrity monitoring and intrusion detection, all that's an activity that's supposed to be happening after you've done everything else, including vulnerability management. So I've always just kind of, and this is why I'm doing the research, trying to figure out when and how and where did vulnerability scanning seem to become the first thing you do in terms of vulnerability management.
I can answer that.
All right, I will shut up and let you talk.
No. So the very simple answer to that's the easy part. What did we look, guys? When we get into cybersecurity, what's the first thing we're taught? Here's a bunch of tools that when you join a company, right? You're doing your first security job. They give you a bunch of tools and they tell you to operate them and tell you here's what the output I want out of this. And that's sort of like, if you don't actually care about what we do for a living, that's what you start to think that security is, running a bunch of tools and getting output. What's the easiest thing to do? Point a vulnerability scanner at a bunch of IP addresses and get some answers. Like, that is the no-brainer version of this. So vulnerability management turned into vulnerability scanning. And in some places, still today, 20 some odd years after this became a thing, we still scan, dump to spreadsheet, maybe do a column sort, done. Next.
Well, okay,
come on.
25
spreadsheets
years, are wonderful. Let's be honest here. Spreadsheets are good. Spreadsheets are fine. Spreadsheets are okay. But yeah, it's a bad idea. So let's even talk about the next level up, where they're not dumping to a spreadsheet. They're dumping to some kind of vulnerability management program, some sort of sorting and ticketing, an ISMS, some sort of ticketing system. So that's not a spreadsheet. That's an actually ticketing system. And most of the vulnerability scanners can actually integrate with, Jira or ServiceNow or one of the other guys, right? How do you feel about that?
So here's my evolution of this stuff, right? As I've watched it, and I just got a text from my buddy Tom McKenzie, who's like, "Hey, you guys mention me." Hey, Tom. So there's an entire industry that does vulnerability management as a platform, right? So I don't know where you guys stand on mentioning company names, so I'll let you tell me if you don't mind me mentioning a couple as we go here. Go
ahead.
Yeah. So look, as a company, right, the way I'm building a vulnerability management program in a box for people is we partner, right? There's no sense in me building yet another tool because that's asinine to a level I don't even want to discuss. So we partner out. In the industry, you've got, much like the 3 accepted names, you've got Rapid7, you've got Qualys, and then you've got Nessus. Like, those are the 3 that everybody knows, right? There's a million other that do the job, but those 3 have evolved to become more. But the evolution of the industry was this: you had scanners for years, and you could scan IP addresses. Then we put them, you put them on the host or in, Mr. Jeff. It is. I meant Tenable, not Nessus, because that's all I know Tenable for.
It's okay.
Sorry,
Tenable
Just
knows
say
it has
Nessus.
an image problem.
Just say Nessus.
But you had the scanners, right? You had the scanners, and they dump out to some screen, and you could when we had 100 servers and 50 laptops, 150 assets worth of screen real estate, not terrible. We could just export that, send it out to somebody, and move on. What we realized quickly was that isn't going to work at the scale most companies started building out to. So then we dumped it to spreadsheet because that's how we do things. That hasn't worked. Now, you've mentioned ticketing platform, Josh, and the ticketing platform is good, but there's a step in between. And that's where you've got companies like Tom's Ranked Right. You've got companies like Qualys has built it. Kenna on the very, 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 very high end of the spectrum, right? Which is where you dump a bunch of vulns. They sort by exploitability, God help you, CVE score, by whether there's POC code in the wild, whether it's actually actively being exploited. So that tries to help you get this notion of prioritization, because the biggest problem, I think, is with operating a program is you quickly accumulate, and this gets into my blog post, but what we've started calling vulnerability debt, right? The first time you scan at your company, you realize you've got like 1 million things. I say you've got 1,000 issues, right? Okay, fine. You can even get those because you can sort by priority and just do the criticals and throw the rest away. But you get to any reasonable scale, you've got 1,000 criticals, 10,000 criticals, and you go, well, crap, that's not hard. And Patch Tuesday comes along, and it's not just Microsoft anymore. Other vendors have jumped on that bus, and so now you've got 5 vendors worth of critical per month. Which ones are actually needing the business to stop what it's doing, patch the systems, and then restart? Like, you're asking for a business to literally halt, do something, restart, right? When I worked at GE, we had systems that had an average of 30 minutes of downtime allotted per year for maintenance.
In production.
In production, correct.
Okay, so you can absolutely, okay, so now we're talking about the actual management and the remediation, not just the tracking and the discovery of. And these are all different phases. But in the remediation, I've seen instances where they remediate, but they don't remediate in production. They remediate in the next iteration that we're going to redo with. So that's the right way to do it, in my opinion. Change your playbooks, your Ansible playbooks, or your containers, or whatever.
Well, it depends on the severity of what you need to remediate. You can't just sit back and say, well, I'm only going to do this in dev prod or dev and QA, and hope that it gets pushed to prod. You have a critical flaw come through, you've got to deal with it. And unfortunately, what a lot of companies don't do is they don't equate that critical flaw over to what is the cost to be able to deal with it if it's exploited versus what is the cost to fix.
So
you said you made a statement. If you have a critical flaw, you have to remediate it. Do you?
If you don't have to remediate it, it's not a critical flaw, right? That's like the definition of a critical flaw, is that it has to be done right now.
No. You don't have to. You actually can accept the risk, and that's why I said a lot of companies struggle with: do we deal with paying now to fix, or do we deal with paying down the road to fix? Is the critical flaw part of like a legacy system that hasn't been properly containerized, hasn't been properly microserviced, hasn't been properly migrated off of legacy hardware? So it's even though you may have a critical be a critical, it's really the realization of the debt that you're incurring by the action that you take on it that a lot of companies don't see the forest through the trees on.
So I will tell you.
I think it somewhat depends on what you're using the nomenclature for, right? Because if you're saying critical, are you saying critical as a prioritization means, or are you saying critical actually just to describe the nature of the vulnerability?
Now we're in it. This is the discussion I wanted to have. Because we label critical.
Before you jump in, let me just throw in that, and this will help, I think, the discussion. PCI doesn't talk about how long you need to fix a vulnerability, how long you have. It does stipulate that you have 30 days to install patches for what they call critical security patches. So they use the word critical in terms of the patch, and they give you 30 days. Go ahead, Raf. Kick it off.
This is where we start to have bar fights, because we get into critical. God, years and years ago, I wrote this blog post when I was with HP. When is critical not? And we treat so IT people that are on that spend time in just security, just in cyber, tend to get the technology view of it. So we get the vendor released a patch and says this is critical, apply now, and you're like, oh, well, it must be critical, must apply now. And the context around it is what I think it makes that. It's like your CVSS score is the highest it can go. You're like, okay, crap, that's bad. But is it? Because there are plenty of systems that are isolated enough to where the raw score, call it, off the internet is a critical. But by the time you look at it through the lens of the company, you're like, yeah, but that's isolated. That has no sensitive data on it. So, I mean, worst case scenario, you take that server over and run remote code, and I probably don't care. So that gets deeper. So you've got your critical in terms of what you can accomplish by exploiting that thing and the impact. And then you've got, like, I'm going to throw a term out there, BIA, your business impact analysis, right? What does that actually mean to the business if that thing were to get popped in that manner? And there are plenty of bugs that are moderate case where, it just causes a denial of service condition. But if you do that on a payroll processing server, while you can't get remote code to run, you can stop payroll. I promise you, one's just as bad as the other. Make sense?
It does, and that's where I was trying to head with what I was saying was understanding the risk to the business and then making that determination is very difficult for a lot of companies to do.
Yeah.
Whether an executive knows the system that the vulnerability belongs to and the patch and what the patch is going to do, it's very difficult for an executive to make that decision. And ultimately, it should come back on risk analysis and risk impact of what do we do if we patch? What do we do if we don't patch? How do we roll it back if we do? But a lot of companies don't have that kind of change management style or are not mature enough in their process to afford a change management control board.
I think one of the things that you and Raf both are kind of touching on is kind of like this idea that you can't just take these things just right out of the box and apply them to your company. You have to have your own prioritization. You have to have your own risk management system.
Correct.
To integrate vuln management into, right?
And this is where, and this is why 85% of the companies that do vulnerability management actually do vulnerability scanning and little else, because they take what the patch says at face value, try to ram it down the business's throat, and the business says, nope, guys, this is not what you think it is, or I simply don't, I don't believe you, I don't care, whatever the reason is. And the prioritization in this, it can't just be a technical prioritization. It simply can't. You have to look at the actual business analysis. You have to look at like raw impact plus what the context of that system is, or what is it doing? Is it processing card transactions? Does it have access to your banking system? Is it simply serving your company's, web page? While if it gets fully compromised, it's embarrassing. But how is it the same as getting your payroll server compromised? Well, hell no. Right.
I would actually take it one step further on what you're saying, Raf. Recently, we had an episode dealing with the ideal of what is a pen test. Realistically, we should be having an episode that says, what is the idea of vulnerability management?
Yeah, take a step back. What is this?
That's what we're doing.
We're having a really good discussion in Discord right now where we're talking about the differences between IT, OT, data center apps, people-based systems, etc. And it's fascinating to discuss how we can repave and rebuild or redo the architecture and then repave a data center system. And while the load is handled by the load balancer, so nobody even notices it went down for the split second to repave. But I can't do that to the laptop in front of somebody. I can patch it and then have them reboot, and nobody really minds a reboot on a Friday or whatever it happens. But I can't do it to an OT ICS system because they're not capable of doing that kind of thing.
Think about the medical space.
Exactly. And Jim Gilson, has been on the show before, is talking about how the OT ICS space is it's not possible. They get, I think he said, somebody said 30 minutes of downtime a year is the maximum. Yeah, so you've got to prioritize your patches really hard to make sure you meet that gateway, that window. That's what Raf
and I are talking about, in that it's more about understanding what's going on with the enterprise system as a whole versus just an endpoint or just a server, right? What's the impact and the ripple effect of getting those patches in place? I used to work for a large multimedia org called Discovery, and we had legacy systems that were running 1.3 billion for the ARR. And if we tried to patch those systems, we take down a $1.3 billion system. We're costing the company money.
You're also fired.
Yeah.
It's a detail. It's a detail at that point. No, I mean, and then there's like legacy systems. For example, Swift. God help you if you screw up Swift at a bank, because it's about as modern as machines I threw out 10 years ago. Okay, and yet it has to be as secure and unimpeachable as anything you can imagine. So it's very difficult in a lot of ways to get things done right. We've got so many different architectures, styles of applications, types, focuses, foci, etc. That it's fascinating to talk about vulnerability management, not just about how you're managing vulnerabilities, but how you're managing vulnerabilities in the face of all these different, I'll call them architectures, if that's okay.
Yes.
And,
by the way,
whether you're a small business to a large business, you need some sort of accountability for when you're installing patches on systems. And realistically, you should keep a flowing log of the patches that are going in. I mean, gentlemen, tell me I'm wrong here.
No. By the way, I'd like to point out that we've simply been talking about patch management so far. Vulnerability management also encompasses AppSec. It also encompasses all your configurations, because in the cloud world, with everything as infrastructure as code, everything is code. You leave a configuration issue where
you got a password in GitHub somewhere.
Port 22 is open to the world.
Yeah, the password in GitHub is a good one.
Yeah, right. Seriously, those are all vulnerabilities, right? And now you've got to explode the world of patch management out into vulnerabilities as a whole, which means you've got more accountability and more stakeholders that you need to bring in. And I think accountability is where things completely fall over. And at some point, I want to get into the lifecycle conversation, because that makes this thing even harder.
Let me ask you directly: if you could pinpoint the top, 5 things that would constitute a vulnerability management program or vulnerability management as a family.
Well,
what would those 5 things? What would that look like?
Let's hold that. That's a great question, Scott. But let's hold that for after the break, when we're shifting gears to how do we get to bitch about it this segment. We're going to try to fix things and solve things and
love it.
Stop world hunger in the second segment. I think to summarize what you were saying, especially early on, Raf, to me, it bubbles up to simply the problem is from a security industry perspective, and I would put most vendors in this category, not just the scan vendors, but they're certainly part of this. Is we're caught between the need for automation. That our networks are so large and complex. There's so many systems and things on our network these days. We desperately need automation, and in our need for automation, we've gotten really, really confused and lost between the idea of having a tool that will help us do our job and getting a solution that does our job for us. I mean, I think that's the highest level problem that we're addressing. But let's take a break. We'll come back. I think we have 2 questions that we need to ask. One is the what Scott is asking is, what are the component parts? What are the steps? What should it look like? That's the first thing that I want to try to tackle in the second segment. The other one, if possible, is how if is it possible, can we do anything to sort of break the mold of everybody thinking that the vulnerability scanning solution, the vulnerability management solution is it's just a matter of picking the right one and setting it up and letting it fire on all cylinders. So that's what I want to tackle. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back in just a minute.